I never imagined that my front lawn, the place I spent hours tending to, the pride of my little home, could turn into a battlefield. But the day Karen moved in next door, everything changed, and I sensed trouble before she even unpacked her first box, because the way she looked at my property, with a mixture of curiosity and disdain, made me uneasy, her sharp eyes scanning every corner as if she were measuring it for herself, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe I had seen too many movies about nosy neighbors, but the feeling didn't go away. It lingered like a storm cloud over my otherwise peaceful street, and the first sign came subtly, a few weeks after she moved in, when I noticed the edge of my grass had been clipped at an odd angle, a line that didn't match the rest of the careful, neat rows I had spent mornings perfecting, and I shrugged, thinking maybe the wind had bent a branch or a neighbor's mower had strayed. But the next morning, the pattern repeated, sharper this time, more deliberate, and a wave of anger and disbelief washed over me because I knew no one had my permission to touch my lawn, my sanctuary, and I felt exposed, like a small piece of my home had been violated. And as the days went on, the incidents became more frequent, each cut more precise and audacious, as if someone was deliberately sending a message that they could invade my space whenever they wanted, and I started watching my windows more closely, noticing Karen leaning over her fence, pretending to water her flowers, her head turning just slightly too often toward my yard, her eyes darting as if she were expecting me to catch her. And I realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't a mistake, it wasn't happenstance, it was intentional, and the realization made my chest tighten, a mixture of fear, frustration, and the urge to confront her bubbling up inside me. But I knew confronting her outright could make things worse, especially in this neighborhood where the HOA rules were strict, and any misstep could turn me into the offender. So I held back, silently recording the times, the angles, the patterns, the way my lawn had become a canvas for someone else's control, and the more I watched, the more I noticed the little things that revealed her character. The way she complained about minor imperfections in her neighbors' yards at HOA meetings, the way she spoke with authority as if the community existed to serve her vision of perfection. And I began to understand that this was bigger than grass, bigger than a few stray cuts. It was about control, about power, about someone who wanted to assert dominance over a space that wasn't hers. And the thought made me tense, pacing in my living room late at night, imagining scenarios, weighing options, calculating whether to involve the HOA, whether to speak to her directly, whether to document everything for legal purposes, and every choice seemed fraught with risk because Karen wasn't the type to back down. She thrived on confrontation, subtle or otherwise, and the thought of her manipulating the rules, twisting facts, turning neighbors against me, made my stomach churn. But I refused to let her take my sense of peace, my pride, my sanctuary without a fight, however careful or clever it had to be. And I remembered the mornings I had spent planting tulips and roses along the edge of my lawn, the afternoons trimming the hedges to perfection, the satisfaction of seeing the sunlight fall just right across the freshly mowed rows, and I knew that if I gave up, it would feel like surrendering a part of myself, a part one had built with care, patience, and love, and that thought steeled my resolve, turning fear into determination, and I began observing her patterns, noting when she watered her flowers, when she left her garage open, when her dog ran into my yard, and slowly, meticulously, I started to see the openings, the tiny cracks in her armor that I could use, not to harm her, but to reclaim what was mine. And the anticipation of turning the tables gave me a strange, exhilarating thrill, a mixture of anxiety and excitement that kept me awake at night, plotting, imagining, preparing for a confrontation that wouldn't involve shouting or anger, but something far more satisfying, subtle, undeniable. And in that quiet, I realized that this story, my story, was no longer just about grass. It was about boundaries, respect, and the courage to stand up for what I loved. And as the sun rose over my street one morning, lighting up every blade of green in my yard, I felt a spark of hope, a sense that the next step, the first real move in this silent war, was approaching, and I was ready, alert, and determined, because no one, not Karen, not the HOA, not anyone, was going to take my home, my peace, or my lawn without understanding that I wasn't someone to be underestimated, and that awareness, quiet but fierce, became the fuel that would carry me through the battles to come, shaping every thought, every plan, every careful observation, and as I stood by my window watching her prune her roses with that same measuring gaze, I smiled faintly, knowing that the quiet tension building between us was only the beginning, and that when the time came, she would understand that she had underestimated me, underestimated the lengths I would go to protect what was mine, underestimated the resolve that had grown with each cut of grass, each stolen moment of my peace, and that knowledge, that simmering promise of justice, filled me with a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation, because I had learned one of the most important lessons about life, about neighbors, and about standing up for yourself, that sometimes the smallest spaces, the most ordinary lawns, can become arenas where courage, strategy, and cleverness matter more than size or strength, and in that realization, I felt a strange sense of empowerment, knowing that the story I was living would soon become a story she would never forget. The days that followed were unbearable, each morning revealing a new affront, a fresh line cut too straight, too deliberate, through the heart of my carefully tended lawn, and I felt a mix of anger and disbelief that only grew stronger with every discovery, because it was no longer subtle or accidental. It had become a game, a silent battle where I was clearly the target and Karen the unchallenged aggressor, and the way she carried herself around the neighborhood only fueled my frustration. Her confident strolls past my yard, the polite, yet pointed greetings that carried a hidden edge, the way she lingered just long enough to make her presence felt but never caught, it was all calculated, and I started to notice the small psychological warfare she was waging, the way she commented in passing about the state of other lawns as if measuring their worth, the way she smiled at the HOA meetings with that self-satisfied expression, knowing that most people were too polite or intimidated to challenge her, and I realized that if I didn't act, I would not only lose my yard but also my sense of control over my own life in the street, and that thought made my stomach churn with a mixture of fear and determination, because I wasn't willing to hand over my sanctuary without a fight. But the fight had to be strategic, smart, and deliberate, not angry or rash, and as I walked across my yard one afternoon, running my fingers along the freshly cut edges, I started making mental notes, cataloging the times she was out, the angles from which she approached, the way her attention drifted, the tiny habits that revealed vulnerabilities, and I began thinking like a tactician rather than a victim, considering options, imagining ways to reclaim my space without direct confrontation, because I knew that if I acted impulsively, I would only give her ammunition to twist the story, to make me the troublemaker in the eyes of the HOA or the neighbors, and that realization made me careful, almost obsessive in my observation, yet it was also empowering because for the first time I felt like I was preparing, not reacting, and every morning, as I opened my blinds and scanned the lawn for new damage, my heart would race, a mixture of anticipation and fear, and some days I caught glimpses of her, bending over her flower beds, her eyes flicking toward my yard with a look that made it clear she knew exactly what she was doing, and I hated that look, hated the arrogance in it, but at the same time it fueled my resolve, sharpening my focus and my planning, because I knew that a confrontation would come, and when it did, it had to be decisive, unmistakable, and clever, something that would speak louder than words or complaints, something that would teach a lesson without crossing any lines I didn't intend to cross, and as the tension built, I found myself imagining scenarios constantly, thinking about ways to reclaim my lawn in a way that was both safe and satisfying, while keeping her off balance, unsure of what would come next, and the thought of her uncertainty made me feel a strange, thrilling sense of control in a situation that had felt increasingly powerless, because power in this neighborhood was subtle, often invisible, and I realized I needed to use it wisely, to leverage every observation, every slight advantage, every little quirk that revealed her habits, and I began documenting everything, photographing the strange lines, the angles, the evidence that no one else was paying attention to, creating a record that was thorough and undeniable, not out of spite, but to ensure that if things escalated, I had proof, and while doing so, I noticed other neighbors beginning to notice the tension, whispering in passing, sharing quick glances over fences, and I knew that the ripples of this quiet war were spreading without me saying a word, and it both worried me and gave me hope, because I could see that Karen's confidence was fragile, built on the assumption that no one would challenge her, and if I played this right, I could shift the balance, but I had to remain patient, disciplined, and above all clever, because one misstep could make me the villain. not her, in the eyes of everyone, and the thought of that possibility made my chest tighten, my mind racing with countermeasures, and I started walking the perimeter of my lawn daily, feeling the grass under my feet, imagining how she might approach next, planning contingencies for every possible scenario, all while keeping my interactions with her polite and measured, never giving her a hint that I was aware of her intentions. Never. Letting her see the storm brewing behind my calm exterior, and the contrast between her brazen confidence and my quiet, calculated vigilance only heightened the tension, making every encounter, every shared glance, every passing moment feel loaded with unspoken power struggles. And as the week turned into 2, I noticed her becoming bolder, placing garden decorations closer to my property line, leaving her trash cans slightly angled toward my yard. Subtle provocations that tested my patience. And I realized that she was deliberately pushing, trying to elicit a reaction, and the realization made my pulse quicken with a mix of irritation and excitement, because I understood that she believed she could manipulate me, that she could force me into an overreaction, but I refused, resolved to remain composed, and in that composure, I found a strange strength, a growing confidence that I could outmaneuver her without stooping to petty retaliation. And the strategy became clearer. In my mind, a plan taking shape that required careful timing, precise execution, and a touch of creativity that would make the lesson unforgettable without crossing any dangerous lines. And every night I lay awake thinking about it, rehearsing it in my head, imagining her reaction, imagining the quiet satisfaction of reclaiming my lawn, the validation of standing my ground without losing my own dignity, and the suspense of that moment, waiting for it to arrive, kept me on edge, made each day feel charged with possibility, while simultaneously building a simmering tension that neither of us could ignore. And I realized that this struggle was no longer just about grass. It was about asserting boundaries, protecting my home, and proving that patience, observation, and strategy could outweigh arrogance and entitlement. And as I watched her across the fence one afternoon, clipping a hedge that skirted my property, a faint smirk on her face as if daring me to react, I felt a thrill of anticipation, knowing that the moment to act would come, that my silent preparation, my careful planning, and my steady resolve would soon converge in a way that Karen would never expect. And that thought, that growing certainty, made my heart pound with adrenaline, because for the first time in weeks, I felt the balance shifting, felt the possibility of reclaiming my peace, and knew that the battle over my lawn, quiet and invisible though it was to anyone else, was about to reach a turning point that would define the rest of this strange, tense, and surprisingly personal war. The tension in the neighborhood grew almost palpably, a quiet pressure that pressed on my chest every time I stepped outside, because Karen had shifted from subtle provocations to bolder, almost theatrical displays, moving her decorations closer to my property line, letting her dog run across my yard under the guise of play, and leaving the sprinkler on in a way that drenched my freshly planted flowers, and every action felt like a calculated challenge, a test of how far she could push me before I snapped. And the frustration simmered beneath the surface, turning every glance in her direction into a study in restraint, every encounter into a battle of patience. And I realized with a mix of dread and determination that this was no longer about grass. It was personal, because the subtle arrogance in her eyes suggested she saw me as an obstacle to be amused at, a neighbor to be toyed with, and that realization ignited a fire inside me, a need not only to protect my lawn but to assert my own sense of control, my own dignity, in the quiet war unfolding across a few meters of grass. And as I watched her one afternoon, crouched near the edge of my yard under the pretense of adjusting her potted plants, I noticed the precision in her movements, the way she measured each step, the way her gaze lingered on my property as if calculating, testing, daring me to react, and that audacity made my blood boil, but also sharpened my focus, because it was clear that any hasty move would play into her hands, turning her petty invasions into victories in the eyes of the HOA and the neighbors who were already whispering about our tension. And I had to be smarter than her, more patient, more deliberate, because the stakes were no longer just my lawn but my reputation, my sense of control, and the pride of my home. And over the next several days, I began noticing patterns in her behavior that I hadn't before, subtle tells that indicated when she was likely to step across the line. The brief pauses before she entered my line of sight, the slight shift of her shoulders, the way she tilted her head when she thought no one was watching, and I realized that she had been underestimating me, assuming that my patience was weakness, that my quiet vigilance meant I was intimidated, and the thought of turning that assumption against her filled me with a strange, thrilling anticipation, because I knew that if I planned carefully, I could reclaim my space in a way that left her speechless. A lesson, delivered without aggression but with undeniable impact, and as I walked around my yard at dusk, noting every inch of my property, running my hands along the edges of the flower beds, imagining her movements, I started envisioning the moment of confrontation, the precise timing, the perfect setup that would assert my authority and leave no doubt that the lawn was mine, and yet the more I planned, the more I realized how personal this had become, because every time I saw her smirk or catch my eye, I felt a surge of indignation, a mix of frustration and fascination, because her behavior had forced me to become hyper-aware, to think like a strategist, and in that process, I discovered a part of myself I hadn't known existed, a patience, a cunning, a capacity for observation and planning that I could wield as effectively as any overt action, and the thought of using it in this quiet duel made the stakes feel electric, charged with tension, because I wasn't simply reacting, I was orchestrating, waiting for the right moment when her overconfidence would be her undoing, and that required watching her, learning her rhythms, and controlling my own impulses, all while maintaining a calm exterior so no one else suspected the depth of the conflict simmering between us. And then one morning, everything escalated when I found that my small vegetable patch had been trampled, the seedlings crushed, not merely by accident, because the footprints were deliberate, heavy, and unmistakably hers, and the sense of violation hit me harder than anything before, twisting my stomach and making my hands shake, because now it was no longer just about lines in the grass or petty provocations. It was about her crossing boundaries in a way that could no longer be ignored, and I realized that the situation had reached a tipping point, a threshold where careful observation and strategy had to turn into decisive action, because letting her continue meant losing not only my lawn but my sense of safety, my control over my own home, and the quiet dignity I had worked so hard to maintain. And as I stood in the ruined patch, anger and adrenaline coiling together, I began planning the first real phase of my response, a way to reclaim my territory that was clever, undeniable, and perfectly measured, so that she would understand in no uncertain terms that she had misjudged me, underestimated my resolve, and violated a line that could not be crossed without consequence. And as I considered the logistics, the timing, the subtle but effective ways to assert my boundaries, I felt a mixture of exhilaration and nervous anticipation, because I knew this was a turning point, the moment when the silent war would begin to reveal itself in full, when she would finally realize that her arrogance had limits, and the idea of catching her off guard, of delivering a lesson without anger but with precise execution, gave me a thrill I hadn't felt in years, a combination of fear, excitement, and satisfaction that made the plan almost intoxicating. And as I watched her through the fence later that afternoon, pruning a bush with the same calculated gaze she always carried, I felt a surge of determination, because I could see the tiniest cracks in her confidence, the subtle signs that she expected no pushback, and I resolved to exploit them, to reclaim not only my lawn but my sense of control, to turn the tables in a way that was unforgettable yet completely safe. And over the next several days, I refined the plan, walking my yard at dawn, noting every angle, imagining her perspective, considering contingencies for every possible reaction, rehearsing the execution in my mind with meticulous care, all while maintaining my usual friendly smiles and casual conversations when she passed by, never revealing the storm building behind my calm facade, and the tension of that dual existence, outwardly composed but inwardly strategizing, made every glance at her, every rustle of her pruning shears, every movement across my property line, feel loaded with significance. And as I lay awake each night, visualizing the moment when everything would shift, I realized that this conflict had changed me, sharpened me, and prepared me for the moment when patience, observation, and planning would finally meet opportunity. And the thought that the next move could redefine the balance of power on this street made my heart race with a combination of dread and exhilaration, because I knew that once the action began, there would be no turning back, and Karen would finally understand that. The lawn was mine, the boundaries were clear, and I was ready to ensure that she would never forget it. The day everything changed began like any other, with the sun casting a soft golden light across my yard, the grass glistening with morning dew. But there was an electricity in the air, a tension I could feel deep in my chest, because for the first time I realized that the plan I had been shaping for weeks had to move from imagination into reality, and the weight of that realization made my pulse quicken, my thoughts sharpening into a razor focus, because this was no longer about patience or observation, it was about action, and one wrong move could ruin everything. Yet I knew I could not wait any longer. The repeated violations, the deliberate provocations, had escalated too far, and I had to reclaim my space before the sense of control I had fought to preserve completely eroded. And I spent the morning walking every inch of my yard, hands running along the edges of my flower beds, eyes scanning the borders, rehearsing every step in my mind, anticipating every potential glance or interruption, and as I positioned myself behind the blinds later that afternoon, watching Karen approach my yard with her usual confident stride, I felt a mixture of fear, adrenaline, and excitement, because I knew this was the moment when the balance would finally shift, and she had no idea, absolutely no idea, that her assumptions about me being passive or timid were about to be shattered in the quietest, most undeniable way, and I could see her pause near the edge of the property, her eyes briefly locking with mine, a faint smirk tugging at her lips, and I knew she thought she had one, that she could continue to assert control without consequence, and the thought made my stomach knot with a combination of anger and determination, because I had waited for this precise moment, the perfect convergence of timing, visibility, and opportunity, and I had prepared something subtle, clever, and completely safe that would make my point in a way she would never forget. And as I moved quietly to set it in place, the sense of secrecy, of a silent duel unfolding just meters apart, made every heartbeat feel amplified, echoing in my ears, the world shrinking until it was just her, me, and the space between us. And then it happened, the first reaction, the brief pause in her movements that told me she had sensed something different, a shift, a change in the energy of my lawn, and that hesitation, that tiny flicker of uncertainty in her confident demeanor, filled me with a rush of anticipation, because it meant she was noticing, beginning to realize that this was no ordinary day, that the usual rules she relied on no longer applied, and I held my breath as she stepped closer, her foot hovering above the edge of my property, the tension so thick it felt like it could be sliced with a knife, and in that instant, I saw the unmistakable spark of surprise and confusion cross her face, a flash of realization that she had misjudged me, that the space she had considered hers to manipulate was firmly under my control, and the sight struck me like lightning, thrilling and terrifying all at once, because it confirmed that everything I had planned, all the careful observation and preparation, had worked, and yet the moment was fleeting, delicate, and I had to maintain composure to let it resonate fully, to make the point undeniable without losing the careful balance I had fought to maintain. And as she froze, glancing around as if trying to understand what had changed, I felt a quiet triumph, a surge of empowerment that spread from my chest to my fingertips, because for the first time, I had reclaimed my lawn not through confrontation or argument, but through strategy, patience, and observation, and the shift in energy was palpable, the quiet power dynamic flipping in an instant, leaving her momentarily speechless, disoriented, and visibly shaken, and I realized with satisfaction that this was the turning point I had envisioned, the moment when the silent battle became a statement, undeniable and unforgettable, and as she slowly retreated, her movements cautious and uncertain, I felt a strange mix of relief and exhilaration, because the tension that had been building for weeks had finally found its release, but I also understood that this was only the beginning, that the balance had changed but vigilance was still necessary, because Karen, prideful and unpredictable, would not forget so easily, and the stakes had risen because the conflict was no longer just about grass, it was about respect, boundaries, and the unspoken assertion of ownership over one's life and space, and I felt every emotion simultaneously, the fear of misstep, the thrill of victory, the anticipation of what might come next, and the profound satisfaction of knowing that I had acted decisively, cleverly, and without anger, delivering a lesson that was both personal and unmistakable. And as I watched her walk back toward her house, casting cautious glances over her shoulder, I knew that the neighborhood, the whispers, the unspoken tension between us, had all shifted irrevocably, and I felt a strange weight lift from my shoulders, replaced by a quiet confidence, because the tables had turned, and I had proven, not to anyone else, but to myself, that patience, strategy, and courage could reclaim what was mine without escalating into chaos. And yet, even in the aftermath of that moment, I could feel the lingering pulse of suspense, the knowledge that Karen's pride and audacity would not fade immediately, that she would be calculating, plotting her next move, and that awareness made my pulse quicken once again, because the story was far from over, and while I had claimed this victory, I understood that the next phase of the conflict, subtle yet decisive, was only just beginning, and the realization that I had entered a new chapter in this quiet war. A chapter where control, cleverness, and patience would continue to define every interaction, filled me with a combination of exhilaration and tension, anticipation and satisfaction, because for the first time, I truly felt the power of reclaiming what had been violated, the quiet thrill of turning the tables, and the unshakable certainty that from this point on, my lawn, my space, and my peace would be defended with careful precision, unwavering resolve, and a newfound sense of authority that Karen would never underestimate again. The day of the climax arrived with a tension so thick I could feel it pressing down on me before I even stepped outside. The sunlight harsh and brilliant on my lawn, highlighting every blade of grass I had fought so hard to protect, and as I positioned myself carefully behind the blinds, heart pounding, I realized that weeks of planning, observation, and patience had all led to this single moment, the moment where the quiet strategy one had nurtured would finally meet action, and I felt a surge of exhilaration mixed with nervous anticipation, because the stakes had never felt higher. Every step of the plan had to be precise, calculated, and flawless, and I knew that Karen, confident as ever, had no idea what was about to unfold, which made the situation both thrilling and terrifying, and I watched her step onto the edge of my lawn, her posture casual, her eyes scanning the yard as if she were testing me one last time, and in that instant, I knew she believed she still had control, believed that she could continue her provocations without consequence, and the sight of that overconfidence fueled my determination, sharpening every sense, every thought, because this was the turning point, the decisive moment that would either end the silent war in my favor or risk prolonging it, and with a deep breath, I initiated the first move of my plan, subtle yet undeniable, a statement of ownership and boundaries that required no confrontation, only precision, timing, and observation, and as I executed it, I watched her reaction with a mix of awe and anticipation, because almost immediately, the effect took hold, her confident stride faltering, a flash of confusion and disbelief crossing her face as she realized that she had underestimated me, that the lawn she had assumed she could manipulate, trespass upon, and subtly dominate, was firmly, decisively, and cleverly reclaimed, and the shift in her demeanor was instantaneous, her smirk fading into stunned silence, a pause that seemed to stretch for minutes even as only seconds passed, and I could see the mental calculation spinning behind her eyes as she tried to understand what had happened, and the sight sent a thrill through me, because it meant that every hour spent observing, planning, and waiting had culminated in this perfect, undeniable moment of triumph, and the emotional weight of that realization struck me with full force, a mixture of vindication, relief, and quiet satisfaction that I had not known I would feel, because it wasn't just about grass or borders anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and the assertion of control over my own space, and as Karen stumbled backward, finally retreating toward her property line with a visible sense of hesitation, I felt the tension that had gripped me for weeks begin to ease, replaced by a charged, triumphant energy, because the lesson had been delivered without anger, without confrontation, only strategy, patience, and unwavering resolve. And as I stepped onto my freshly reclaimed lawn, feeling the familiar texture under my feet, the sight of every flower, every hedge, every precise line of grass untouched and restored, filled me with a deep, almost cinematic sense of victory, and I realized that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, that Karen would think twice before encroaching again, and that the neighborhood itself seemed to sense the change, whispers beginning to spread, glances exchanged over fences, neighbors quietly acknowledging the unseen but undeniable shift, and I felt a strange mixture of pride and relief, because the validation was not just internal, it was visible in the subtle dynamics around me, and yet, even in the midst of that triumph, I understood that fallout was inevitable, because someone as prideful and stubborn as Karen would not disappear quietly. She would test boundaries in smaller ways. She would linger near the edges, calculating her next move, and that awareness made my heart race again. But this time with confidence rather than fear, because I knew that the first decisive blow had been struck, and that it had set the tone, that every future interaction would now begin with a baseline of respect, enforced subtly, cleverly, and unmistakably. And as I watched her finally retreat into her house, closing the door with a hesitant motion, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to savor the quiet thrill of the victory, the emotional release of weeks of tension, and the satisfaction of knowing that I had acted with both intelligence and patience, asserting my rights without aggression, teaching a lesson without cruelty, and yet, even in that relief, I could feel the lingering pulse of anticipation, the knowledge that this was only one chapter in the ongoing story of boundaries, respect, and vigilance, because someone like Karen would never give up entirely. She would adapt, calculate, and attempt to regain her foothold, and the awareness of that kept me alert, ready, and thoughtful, because winning didn't end with a single move. It required continued attention, continued strategy, and a calm but firm assertion of authority. And as the sun shifted in the sky and the afternoon shadows lengthened across my lawn, I walked the perimeter, slowly, touching each flower, each blade of grass, reaffirming my presence, my control, my ownership, and I realized that in this quiet, cinematic moment of triumph, I had gained more than just a clean, untouched lawn. I had gained confidence, patience, and the knowledge that intelligence, observation, and careful action could reclaim what was yours without resorting to conflict. And as I looked toward Karen's house, her blinds closed, her movements tentative inside, I knew that she understood, even without words, that the tables had turned, that the balance of power had shifted, and that she would carry the lesson with her every time she glanced toward my property, and the realization that this moment, this careful, clever reclaiming of what was mine, had been executed flawlessly, gave me a profound sense of accomplishment, a cinematic feeling of resolution, even as I remained aware that vigilance would always be necessary in a neighborhood like this. And in that charged, emotional, triumphant moment, I felt a clarity I hadn't known before, a satisfaction rooted not in anger or revenge but in intelligence, strategy, and the quiet assertion of boundaries. And I understood fully that this day would be remembered, not for confrontation or chaos, but for the careful, dramatic, undeniable reclaiming of control. And as I stood there, the wind moving gently through the grass, the sunlight casting perfect lines across the yard, I knew with absolute certainty that my lawn, my sanctuary, and my peace had been restored, that the tables had been turned, and that the memory of this moment, the emotional weight, the triumph, and the lesson delivered with precision, would linger far longer than any petty provocation ever could. I in the days that followed the decisive moment. A strange calm settled over the neighborhood, a quiet tension that was different from the weeks of constant unease I had lived through, because the lesson had been delivered and the boundaries had been made unmistakably clear, and I could see it in the way Karen moved about her yard now. Cautious, almost tentative, avoiding the edge of my property as if the invisible line I had drawn had become a wall she dared not cross, and watching her from my porch, a sense of quiet triumph washed over me. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the deep, enduring relief of reclaiming what was mine, of standing my ground with patience, strategy, and composure. And it was more powerful than I could have imagined, because for weeks, every glance out the window had been fraught with stress, suspicion, and anger. But now, as I sipped my morning coffee and let the sunlight warm the edges of my yard, there was a sense of peace, a restoration of order, a feeling that my home was mine again, fully and unquestionably, and I noticed subtle changes in myself as well, a newfound confidence that came from having faced a persistent challenge without losing my sense of dignity or control, and I realized that the experience had sharpened my awareness, my patience, and my ability to act decisively, and those lessons were far more valuable than any victory over a neighbor, because they reminded me that true power often lies in observation, strategy, and calm resolve rather than confrontation. And as the week unfolded, I began reconnecting with the parts of my yard and my life that had felt overshadowed by the constant tension, tending to my flower beds with renewed care, trimming the hedges with precision, planting new blooms with a sense of quiet joy, and each act felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, reassurance that the sanctuary I had built with patience and love remained intact. And I noticed the neighborhood responding as well, subtle shifts in glances and greetings that acknowledged the restored balance, the quiet assertion of boundaries that everyone could sense, and even Karen, though still proud and assertive in her way, seemed to respect the invisible limits, the line she had once tested now firmly established in her mind, and I felt a mixture of satisfaction and curiosity about how she would internalize the experience, whether she would reflect on the lesson or quietly try to regain control in smaller ways. But either way, the immediate threat to my peace had ended, leaving space for reflection, and as I walked my lawn in the cool evenings, feeling the grass beneath my feet, watching the sunlight filter through the trees, I realized that the conflict had changed both of us in ways that weren't immediately visible, shaping our behavior, our awareness, and perhaps even our understanding of boundaries, and I found myself thinking about the subtle power of quiet, intelligent action, the ability to protect what matters without aggression, and the way patience and observation can create opportunities for resolution that brute force cannot. And in that reflection, I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not only for the restoration of my lawn but for the insight I had gained about myself, my neighborhood, and the dynamics that govern even the most ordinary spaces. And as the weeks turned into months, I noticed the residual tension fade, replaced by a calm coexistence. Neighbors nodding in passing, conversations resuming without the undercurrent of unease that had dominated the previous months, and even Karen, though still a presence I could feel when I looked toward her house, moved with a measured caution, a recognition that the balance of respect had shifted, and in that shift, I discovered a quiet empowerment, the understanding that standing firm, acting strategically, and maintaining dignity could influence the world around me without creating chaos or resentment. And it was in that empowerment that I found a lasting satisfaction, because the conflict, though intense and emotionally charged, had resulted not in bitterness, but in clarity, peace, and a stronger sense of self. And as I sat on my porch one golden evening, watching the light fall across my lawn, noticing how every flower, every hedge, every careful line of grass glowed in the soft warmth, I felt a profound connection to the space I had nurtured, a deep pride not only in the lawn itself but in the courage, patience, and intelligence I had exercised. And I understood that the true victory had been internal as much as external, a confirmation that I could face challenges, assert boundaries, and reclaim what was important without compromising my integrity. And as I breathed in the quiet evening air, the faint rustle of leaves whispering in the wind, I thought about how this experience would linger in memory, a reminder that conflicts, even small and domestic, can teach resilience, strategic thinking, and self-respect. And I realized that my relationship with the neighborhood, with Karen, and with my own sense of home had changed irrevocably, strengthened by the challenges we had navigated. And that sense of permanence, of earned peace, filled me with a cinematic, almost cinematic satisfaction, because every moment of tension, every careful observation, every patient step had led to this resolution. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across my perfectly maintained lawn, I felt a serene certainty that this chapter, though intense and emotional, had reached its conclusion, leaving space for reflection, for growth, and for the quiet joy of knowing that I had protected what was mine, not with anger, not with retaliation, but with intelligence, patience, and unwavering resolve, and that knowledge, deeper than any fleeting victory, was more satisfying than I could have imagined, a lasting affirmation that boundaries, respect, and the courage to act thoughtfully can create peace even after the most personal and intense conflict. In the months that followed, a quiet transformation settled over my life, subtle but profound, because the intensity of the conflict with Karen had left an imprint not only on my lawn but on the way I approached boundaries, patience, and the value of observation. And I realized that the lessons I had learned in those weeks of tension extended far beyond the edges of my property, shaping the way I interacted with my neighbors, my community, and even myself, because I had discovered a strength I hadn't fully appreciated, a calm decisiveness, and a confidence born of careful preparation. And that awareness colored everything, from small daily decisions to larger choices about how I managed my home and relationships, giving me a sense of control and clarity that had been absent before. And as I tended my yard, each blade of grass, each flower, each hedge now a reflection not only of care, and attention but of strategy, patience, and self-respect. I could feel the rhythm of life returning to a pace I had long missed, one where beauty, order, and personal peace coexisted with vigilance, because I knew now that safeguarding what mattered required more than brute force. It required thoughtfulness, foresight, and the courage to act decisively when the time was right. And in that rhythm, I found a deep satisfaction, a joy rooted in knowing that I had faced a challenge without compromising my integrity, without letting fear or anger dictate my actions, and the quiet acknowledgement that Karen had been forced to respect boundaries without a single word of confrontation gave me an unexpected but profound sense of empowerment. Because true victories, I realized, often unfold silently, their impact resonating more strongly than the noise of anger or aggression ever could. And as the neighborhood itself adjusted to the new equilibrium, subtle shifts in behavior, glances of mutual respect, and quiet recognition of space reflected the balance I had restored. And it was a reminder that our environments are not only physical but psychological, shaped by presence, observation, and the courage to assert what is rightfully ours, and those realizations carried into my personal life as well, influencing the way I approach challenges at work, relationships with friends, and even my own sense of self, because I had learned that careful planning, patience, and strategy could allow me to navigate conflicts with intelligence rather than reaction, turning even difficult situations into opportunities for growth, and that understanding became a touchstone, a guiding principle that shaped my decisions in ways I hadn't anticipated, giving me a confidence that radiated quietly but unmistakably, because I knew that the strength I had discovered was enduring, not circumstantial. And as I walked through my now pristine lawn on cool evenings, feeling the texture of grass beneath my feet, watching the way sunlight or moonlight touched the hedges and flowers, I reflected on the emotional journey, the anxiety, the tension, the moments of doubt and anticipation that had stretched me to my limits, and I realized that the intensity of those experiences had refined me, revealing my resilience, my cleverness, and my ability to act with deliberate purpose. And in that reflection, I found gratitude, not for the conflict itself, but for the clarity and growth it had produced, because I had emerged from it not only victorious in the practical sense but stronger, wiser, and more attuned to the power of observation, patience, and careful, thoughtful action. And I recognized that these lessons extended beyond lawns, neighbors, and petty disputes, touching every aspect of life where boundaries must be set, respected, and enforced, where patience and strategy can achieve results that anger and impulsiveness cannot. And I felt a profound sense of peace in knowing that the measures I had taken, the decisions I had made, and the calm assertiveness I had exercised had left an indelible mark, not only on Karen and the neighborhood but on myself, solidifying an internal authority and self-assurance that no external challenge could easily shake. And as I sat on my porch in the fading light, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of everyday life, I considered the subtle ways our actions ripple outward, how the courage to stand firm, to act with intention, and to reclaim what belongs to us resonates beyond the immediate moment, shaping perceptions, relationships, and even the energy of the spaces we inhabit. And that realization gave me a quiet satisfaction, a sense that my life had gained depth and texture from what had initially seemed like a petty, frustrating battle, and I understood that true resilience is built not from avoiding challenges, but from facing them with clarity, patience, and integrity, allowing intelligence and strategy to guide responses. And in that understanding, I felt an unexpected liberation, a freedom that came from knowing I could navigate any conflict with measured strength, that boundaries I defended thoughtfully would endure, and that respect earned through observation and careful action holds a power far greater than intimidation or noise. And as the months passed, I watched the subtle evolution of Karen as well, her movements still deliberate, her confidence slightly tempered, and though we were still neighbors, the dynamic had shifted in a way that no words could fully express, because actions, carefully planned and decisively executed, had spoken louder than confrontation ever could. And witnessing that change reinforced the lessons I had internalized about patience, strategy, and quiet power, and I began to notice how my own approach to life outside of this conflict had improved. The ability to assess situations, observe behaviors, and act decisively yet calmly became a tool I applied in work, relationships, and everyday challenges, and it felt transformative because I had discovered that the skills honed in a single, focused conflict could ripple outward, strengthening my confidence, my judgment, and my sense of self, And in the evenings, as I sat in the warm glow of the setting sun, the shadows stretching across the lawn I had protected and nurtured, I understood fully that the story was not about victory over a neighbor but about the growth, insight, and self-assurance that came from facing a personal challenge and handling it with patience, intelligence, and integrity, and that realization filled me with a sense of cinematic closure, a feeling that the chapter had ended, not with bitterness, but with dignity, respect, and a lasting lesson, and I knew, as I looked over the calm, orderly rows of grass, the flowers standing tall, and the hedges perfectly trimmed, that the true reward had been the knowledge that I could face conflict, assert my boundaries, and emerge stronger, wiser, and more in control of my life than I had ever imagined, and that understanding, quiet yet profound, would stay with me far longer than any moment of frustration or fear, leaving me with a lasting sense of empowerment, reflection, and the deep, enduring satisfaction of having reclaimed not only my lawn but a piece of myself. And as night fell and the stars began to shimmer above the neighborhood, I felt a sense of peace so complete it almost vibrated through me, because the lessons of patience, strategy, and self-respect were now woven into the fabric of my life. A quiet yet powerful reminder that challenges, no matter how personal or intense, can be met with courage, thoughtfulness, and clarity, and that the strength we discover within ourselves during those moments is the most lasting victory of all.